What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
All right, welcome to episode 13 of Reframing the Narrative. Jake, it's great to see you as always once again. This week we are talking about a very important subject that everyone on the truth journey runs into on some level and at some point, and that is cognitive dissonance and how to deal with it and just managing it and knowing that it's going to be encountered by anyone who may not be necessarily ready for the truth. And even when they are, it's hard for them to reconcile their worldviews together all at once. And that's sort of my beginning preamble. Jake, I know you've had some thoughts since the last time we got together. Why don't you get us started and we'll just take it from there.
It's good to be back with you. Feels like we got the band back together. It's been 2 weeks since we've been together, and it's nice. And I'm outside, so if you hear me shivering, that's why, or if you hear the wind buffeting. So cognitive dissonance, the reason I feel it's really important is that when you're on kind of like the truth journey, you might experience it yourself at first, and it's something you might need to befriend and become acquainted with and then overcome. And the same goes for when you get to the point where you are feeling you have a good handle on maybe the way things are, or certainly the way things could or should be, and you are surrounded by people who aren't necessarily on board with that. And they look up at the sky and they see checkerboards and they're like, contrails. And you feel like, oh my, I just want to hang out with a bunch of people with our truther community. And you just don't have the energy to speak with them and kind of chip at that exterior of cognitive dissonance. That's an example. But a lot of times I found that that's just a natural reaction that people have. And most people are just cruising along. They're in whatever gear you're on in the highway. They're just in drive. They're going forward and they're cruising, and they don't really necessarily sense that something's wrong on a rational level. But these days, I think we're at a point where almost everyone's on edge. Almost everyone feels like there's something awry, no matter what side of the so-called, left and right paradigm or political spectrum they may be on, or if they're beyond that. People are feeling really uneasy and anxious, and there's good opportunity to have conversations with people. But I think in the second part of the conversation, we'll get into our experiences and maybe mistakes that we've made in approaching people or just having dinner table conversations with people and not being able to break through. So what have we learned from that? I think it would be fun to kind of go into examples of cognitive dissonance that we've either experienced ourselves or we've witnessed. Do you have any really classic examples that you could give us today, PJ? And then I'll give mine.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number that I can think of, either dealing with people trying to, quote unquote, wake them up, or even in my own experiences and journeys to grapple with things that I didn't necessarily think I would ever grapple with. I think the ground is fertile for that. But I think that another extension of this conversation, and I have to give a nod of the hat to Paul Hobbs from Understanding Conspiracy. He did a Tips for Truthers recently where he said, basically, choose your battles wisely, because there are a number of people out there who simply aren't ready to hear these nuggets of truth, or may not even have the mental faculty to do so. And I think part of our learning and growth as people who have been given the gift of being, quote unquote awake is knowing the right time to have these conversations with people. And I even experienced this recently when I was back home catching up with old friends. There was so many points where I was tempted to shut down some rather silly conversations I overheard or was involved with, things involving space or cryogenic saving of heads and all sorts of weird things that people who are totally caught up in the material world and also, approach things from an atheistic standpoint. Some of the things they do to think about self-preservation or like the so-called evolution or advancement of mankind. There's certain times where you feel like, well, if I could just present to them, here's actually the bigger piece of the picture that you're missing, and here's why what you're saying is certifiably insane. It feels like a natural reaction to something being proposed, like shooting your ashes into space or having your head preserved cryogenically or anything like that. But there are people who earnestly believe in everything the institutions have taught them and unfortunately believe the lie that we're accidental space dust and here on random chance. And you're not going to overcome all of that in one night or in one sitting. And I think the best we can do is to recognize when someone is open to hearing something and plant seeds, more ask questions than give answers. And for our viewers who may have seen a few of my videos on the Central Texas rabbit hole, you'll probably see that that's my approach, is to not force feed the answer, but more leave room for people to interpret and draw their own conclusions. And I think that's the approach that we should use as a community overall versus trying to, go to some extreme, like the classic, much parodied example of Alex Jones saying they're making the frogs gay. That's an extreme example. Gay? Exactly. That's an extreme example of trying to jump ahead to a conclusion that you haven't laid the foundation for someone to fully understand. And, I'll just give a personal example. And this harkens back to, Jake, when you and I met, and we talked about this a little bit during our conversation with Michael Jaguar last week, where, in those formative times in that community, I was along a path of reawakening and thought I had reached kind of the end point. And I was like, okay, I really need to start a podcast and make videos and learn how to do all that. And of course, it took me 4 or 5 years later to finally do that. But that being said, I remember the first conversation I had with a guy who was a flat Earth proponent. And I remember sitting there going, okay, yeah, but like, what's the sky then? What am I looking at? And that was me trying to process, like, okay, if any of this is true, I need you to help me understand it. And like, I couldn't grasp the concept in my head because I needed it to be positioned in a way that I could see my new reality. And even then, it wasn't me trying to say that it was impossible, although there was a high degree of skepticism because, as we all know, no one becomes a flat earther, voluntarily. They do it looking into things and many times trying to refute them. But, for me, even then, I was like, well, that doesn't even make sense. And I remember that particular guy was trying to tell me something about the water and the sky, and it just sounded like a bunch of hippie mumbo jumbo. And I was like, okay, well, one day I'm going to figure out what these people are talking about. And, that's what started my journey. And it was a slow walk to getting to that point. Like, oh shit, yeah, we're not living on a spinning ball. It's physically impossible. But it took me many steps. And as our viewers and listeners will probably have heard me say more than once, I started that slow walk listening to Iwaranon and What on Earth Happened. And having rewatched that recently for future videos I'm planning, it was very clear that he stood on the shoulders of giants, people like Eric Dubay and Rob Skiba and others. And he just did a really good job of compiling a lot of their work. But all that being said, for me to now at this point say, globe Earth is certifiably insane and it can be, well, disproven is in the eye of the beholder, but there's a lot of physical proofs that just is not reality. Now, what we live on and in, it's open for discussion, and there's certain things we can infer and other things we may never know until the next life. But that being said, that was a very long-winded answer to say that, even having been open to being presented with a new idea, it took me many steps to say, okay, well then how could this be true? And how do I see the world now? And how do I make sense of it? So that's a really good lesson from my point of view for all of us to think of, like, we're in the advanced class, right? We've grappled with a lot of these things. We've gone down that road and we see the picture more clearly now. You have to understand when you present someone with information that they have a very limited view. And for you to say, don't you see the picture, when you're trying to show them the picture through a little tiny pinhole, that's kind of your own fault for not realizing that people take time to see a lot of these things, and they have to do that journey of discovery on their own at their own pace.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think sometimes the best we can do is maybe just, like I said, kind of chip at that exterior a little bit and see if something cracks and if there's any interest in engagement. And I think part of getting people to engage is just the way you carry yourself as a person. And when you talk about things, you open your mouth, you bring perspectives and you bring facts to the conversation, and people end up liking you and trusting you just like they would in business or any kind of affairs out in the real world. And so when you bring that credibility to a conversation, even if it's something they've never thought of, they might say, well, okay, PJ, I've never thought of that, but their subconscious is thinking, I trust this guy, PJ. He always makes sense. And so maybe I'll ask another question, or maybe I'll look into it myself, and you just never know where it's going to go. So I think that credibility and being up on what you, I want to say believe, but I think beliefs are just so overrated these days. Like, what do we know? That's where we are, and just being honest about where you are. I've been in the same situation where I was a friend. It was late at night. It was so hilarious. Late at night in the car with a friend, he calls this other friend who's in another state. He's like, just get on board with me about this flat earth thing. I could almost feel the eyes rolling of the guy on the other end of the phone late at night, getting that call. And my friend beside me in the car is just going, yeah, you guys, you got to get on board with this. And neither of us would budge. And we were throwing all these questions at him. And I don't know if it was cognitive dissonance or it's just something we hadn't experienced. And eventually I came around, and I guess I would call it true Earth. I don't really know what the nature of the planet is, but like you, I have a hard time getting on board with the whole spinning water ball thing, especially when they come up with the angle at which we're tilting and all that kind of stuff, because it's just always satanic. And it's kind of comical. But I thought, speaking of comical, I'd give my doozy. So what's the definition, first of all, of cognitive dissonance? It's basically when you have a belief and another belief comes along and challenges it, and your mind or even your ego cannot hold two beliefs at the same time. And so you're going to push back. And the ego is trying to defend. I think there's something to the idea that the ego is there to protect us, and it's also tied up in our identity. So if we identify as somebody who's educated, and so many people do, I mean, how many people, I think we have statistics on the more educated and, in my view, indoctrinated people are, the more they were likely to fall for the scamdemic of 2020, and the more boosters they're going to get, and the more they're going to wear a mask. Even these days, I saw a ton of masks out there while I was out and about recently. And so that's something that may be tied up with their identity and their ego, and it's going to be hard to crack. And maybe that's just something that is never going to change, and it's just not a conversation or somebody we're ever going to need to engage in conversation. But if they're actually smart, who knows? You might get them after they've had a couple drinks and they're open to something. You just never know if that trust is there. So for my doozy of cognitive dissonance story, as some people may have picked up from our previous episodes, I mentioned that I am fluent in a couple foreign languages, one of them being Mandarin Chinese. And so my story involves me going on a long distance train ride in China many years ago, where I was surrounded by Chinese people, of course, on the train, and the train had to make a stop for repairs or to allow an obstruction to clear something down the tracks. I don't know what, but everybody had to get off. And I was traveling with a companion who was not a native speaker of Chinese, but we were up on the platform and we were talking to a native speaker of Chinese who we met on the train. And as we're standing there on the platform, we're speaking 100% Mandarin from start to finish. And I heard behind me, somebody says to another person, kind of like in peanut gallery style, "Wow, my English must have really improved because I understand everything they just said." So that's a perfect example for me of cognitive dissonance. And the reason I remembered it for 35 years is that this person, they were seeing two white people, two Western looking people speaking Chinese, and their head just couldn't get around it. Like, they have to be speaking English. So my English must have been really good to understand everything they were saying. And that's just the perfect example. Sometimes it just results in their brain frying. Yeah, so that's my classic example.
That's pretty hilarious. I don't know that I have anything quite comparable to that. But just as a funny aside, I was thinking about just the cognitive dissonance of two worlds colliding that were not quite planned, and just, you're talking about people are in a certain gear, and I'm just going to go ahead and share a recent anecdote of something that happened with me. And I think it's a pretty funny story, just an example of how, in this case, it was unintentional, but still, like, you have to pick the right place and time to present some of these ideas or concepts to people kind of still locked in the matrix and not really having opened themselves to looking behind the curtain. I was actually at a small flat earth meetup here in Austin recently, and I had the opportunity to have met with the organizer, and it was early before some other people had shown up, and no one had made a sign. We put something up on Meetup, and that there was, it was basically open to anyone who could attend and was interested and happened to somehow find that. And it just so happens there was one person who had RSVP'd that no one knew who this person was. And I showed up to this event with my hoax shirt on that I think our viewers will remember from our landing on a hoax video about the moon landing. And I am walking, we had decided to move our party indoors, and I'm walking towards the indoors, and I run into a former colleague and also like a professional contact who just happens to be in Austin for the day, someone I did not expect to see. And I run into this guy, and we see each other and we start small talking, and I'm going, okay, this guy's going to see my hoax shirt. Like, this is going to be interesting. But it actually gets much more interesting than that, because this guy who no one knew, who RSVP'd, walks right up to me and says, "Flat Earth Group?" All I could do is nod and say, "Yeah, they're setting up a table over there." So you should have seen the look on this guy's face. I could see the thought bubble coming out from on top of his head, like, who is this guy even? Like, he's a flat earther, and like I thought this guy was educated and smart. And I tried to play it off, and I said, hey, if you want to come discuss crazy conspiracy theories with us, you're welcome to, making it a little bit of a joke. But this guy sort of had this, I don't even know what just happened, look about his face. Is like, I think I'm just going to go over here and order some food. And I was like, well,
Garrison.
yeah. So, that I was like, all I could do was be polite and said, well, that food truck over there would be a great one, but it's just so funny because, that was an example of opening up an idea to someone who was just not there at all. And, in this case, I'm not super worried about it, in terms of like my quote unquote professional network. But, it is one of those things that, has been noted by many people that, especially in a workplace setting, you got to be careful who you share these ideas with, because they can be viewed as either, idiotic and or dangerous. And it's just something for all of us to keep in mind. But it did turn out to be a really funny story that, in my case, like, hard to say that you're not in the flat earth group with the shirt that says hoax and shows satellites and globe earth and all the rest of it. So, yeah, it's just something to keep in mind, I think, for everyone. And I know we've all been there, but just, picking your time and place for trying to walk someone down the path, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Yeah. And there's countless opportunities to do that. And I was at a meeting this morning with somebody, and I mentioned, that he knows I do podcasts. He knows that I do video and things like that in my professional life. And I mentioned, I do more than one podcast. In fact, one of them is kind of, I have an avatar. It's not my real name. And we don't like to identify as conspiracy theorists because we feel like that's just that's not who we are, and it's kind of a loaded term. But we did do an entire episode on the moon hoax, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, this guy on Zoom, he always has that background with the glowing globe behind him. You know how that's one of those Zoom backgrounds that comes with it, and then some of them are like almost in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon or something like that, with the fake Earth in the background. So I don't know how he thought about that, but you never know. He might just run with it. He might ask about it sometime. Who knows? Yeah, but I wanted to talk about sometimes I think people, they feel like they're really knowledgeable in a lot of things, and they're just so tied up in that and going with the program that even something, or maybe it's not even education or anything like that. Maybe it's just that we're so indoctrinated, we're swimming in the ether of propaganda that, especially as an American, like the even cracking the whole idea or overturning the idea of American exceptionalism. I think Americans, it's a hard thing for us to feel like we're just a country trying to get along in this world. But then you get to politics, and people just automatically get to political discussions, and even just kind of laying the paradigm at them that I don't fall into this whole thing. It just short circuits their brain. If you might have somebody who you feel aligned with. There's a neighbor of mine, I heard him, he listens to his YouTube or podcasts sometimes on speaker, and we're out getting mail. And I heard one time, this is years ago, I heard him listening to somebody I like to listen to sometimes, a YouTuber named Anomaly. I don't know if you're familiar with Anomaly. Long-haired former liberal guy who's kind of jumped aboard the Trump train at one point and now is kind of beyond that. Anyway, my neighbor, I was like, okay, this is safe territory. I can at least discuss like the scamdemic and things like that with him. And then I ran into him the other day and I told him, I gave him some kind of opinion or information. And the first thing he did was just like attack the left. He's still in that camp. And so his cognitive dissonance is that, well, my side can't possibly be misguided or not have my best interest at heart. There's got to be a solution within the government paradigm and the system that's been set up. But personally, I'm not there. I am just beyond believing that any government is going to ever help us. And I believe that the system is working exactly how it's designed, and that's to exploit the living daylights out of us in all resources on the earth. And America is an empire, not a country. And by the way, it's a corporation incorporated in Washington, D.C. So things like that, just you might have somebody you feel allied with and aligned with, but then they fall back into something, and it's just, where do you go from there? So where do you go when you have somebody like that, where you feel like you have a potential ally, but he just doesn't get it? He looks up in the sky and he sees contrails.
Well, I think that's a good question, and I think there's a lot of comments we can make about, potential breadcrumbs to lead someone to the next level of understanding. But I think it's also true that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And someone has to have the desire to want to follow that breadcrumb trail, right? And if they're not willing to go there, then you just kind of have to understand where the boundaries are, because it's sort of like the scripture says about casting your pearls to swine. You're really just wasting your time and energy on someone who will just trample over it and not really be open to the discussion you were hoping for. But I think that there's a much deeper point here that I think we all have to realize that causes the cognitive dissonance. And that is that when you, for example, try to explain to people that government is a scam and that they don't have your best interests at heart, and you explain to them why you don't vote and why you try not to participate in certain elements of the beast system, even taking it a step further, that some faction or element of government or agencies or whatever the case may be were involved in, incidents like 9/11, where even over the weekend, I finally started cracking into Dr. Judy Wood's book about where did the towers go. And the evidence is just so clear that there was really only one answer to how that all happened. And maybe that's a future episode for us to dig into. But, she, as a physicist and a physics professor, had watched it all go down on TV and was like, what I'm seeing is not possible based on the story that we're being given. And she had to speak up, or she had attempted early on when everything was happening and trying to get her other professors and people to see that. And the truth was, no one wanted to even consider the idea that something so sinister would have been planned to forward an agenda. And that the larger point I'm getting to here is that when you start sharing certain truths with people, you are literally ripping away the structure of the society and the framework that they've built in their mind over many years. And to suddenly say what you believe in is a lie, that the system is actually corrupt in more ways than you can even comprehend right now. How many people actually want to hear that and challenge the beliefs that they've made a comfortable framework around? And I think that's what we really have to understand as we're sharing some of these things.
Yeah.
And you have to give people the time and space to process it. there are things that I had seen before and knew of before reading this book by Dr. Judy Wood. But my goodness, it's just so clear as day. I mean, I'll just give one little tidbit from her book that when you put all these things together, it really does point to directed energy, and that just opens another can of worms for people to go, well, where did that come from, and why were they doing that, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to be at a certain point to follow that trail and go, okay, so then what? And but the like, she made a really great example of the they call the bathtub basin that was underneath the towers.
Yeah.
And how if it had truly collapsed under the weight of, if it was jet fuel supposedly and all that caused them to collapse, or if it really was a controlled demolition, even then all the collapsing of levels of the basically a 500,000 ton structure collapsing in on itself would have utterly destroyed that basin and caused major flooding in New York. And that actually did not happen. And when they had finally removed all the debris after that event and they took pictures, you could see that it was barely scathed from all of that. And that's just clear evidence that had there been anything close to the mainstream explanation or the mainstream alternative explanation, neither of them stack up to the physical evidence. And that, to me, I mean, there's so much more to dig into there. And like I said, maybe that could be its own discussion for another day. But, the implications of that are pretty huge. And most people would, I mean, that's another level of the 9/11 discussion altogether, right? You would not want to start there with someone. I mean, just for them to understand that, like, the improbability of the passport landing in front of an FBI agent, like some of these silly stories just going, does that make sense to you? I think are more of a starting point. But yeah, there's just so much to wrap your head around that, then people will ask the common question, why would they lie? How could they get away with, people knowing about it? How could it not all be exposed? I mean, these are all the things that you have to be ready for, but I think it's one little kernel at a time.
Definitely. And I think one thing that I was thinking about as you were relating that is that maybe that's where you are, and maybe that's where I am going to end up with that conclusion. But we don't really need to have the answers when it comes to a bunch of these things if we have the right questions, and if we voice those questions to people and they're valid in people's minds, then they will go on their own journey, and they might end up like, leapfrogging ahead of where we've been on certain things. You just never know where people are going to go on their quest for truth. So one thing I've learned in dealing with people who are willing to humor me and have a conversation is you don't have to have the answers, and it's okay. So taking, the bug theory, for example, if you have a conversation and you bring up the whole idea of virology being basically just torturing a bunch of cells, and then electron microscopy, the way that works in that viruses might not even exist, for instance, then the inevitable question is, well, how do people get sick? You don't have to have that answer. It's the same thing as saying, I know that the 98-year-old woman down the street could not possibly have gone into that 7-Eleven and held it up at gunpoint. It definitely wasn't her. I know that somebody went in and there was an armed robbery at the 7-Eleven, but I know it wasn't. It definitely wasn't her, that kind of thing. And they're trying to pin it on her. She hasn't been out of her house in 6 years. I don't have to have the answer. I just have to know that it wasn't Auntie Elizabeth down the street. And another good example would be, 9/11 is another one. For instance, like you don't have to know that exactly what happened. You just have to maybe make light of the passport story, or you can say, well, I don't think 19 guys living in caves out of Afghanistan could get the U.S. Air defense to stand down. Did you know about that? It stood down. There were drills that day, things like that. Somebody might be off to the races with that line of questioning. So it's important not to be a know-it-all and say, well, it's this or that. Then you start sounding like a crazy person. And if you are not absolutely certain, then you do kind of set yourself up to looking like an idiot or a crazy person. Another good example would be like, well, if government, in my view, let's say this is something that I might say, I think they're all actors. They're basically acting out ancient plays, and everything's scripted, and everything is a ritual for public consumption, and the degree of realism with things varies depending on how important it is and how many people are involved, etc. And then you'll inevitably get the question, well, then who is it? There doesn't have to be an it there. Maybe there is. Maybe there is one precise answer, but to have a conversation and to guide somebody past the cognitive dissonance into a line of questioning and a quest for truth, you don't have to have those answers. When it comes down to it, if you know that somebody is harming you and somebody's trying to shape the way you live, maybe it's not that important exactly who they are and what they look like and what they believe, because they're after you. You're the prey. That's what matters at that moment. It's like that classic scene in My Cousin Vinny where Joe Pesci tells Marissa Tomei he's going deer hunting with the opposing counsel.
What about these pants I got on? You think they're okay?
Imagine you're a deer. You're prancing along, you get thirsty, you spot a little brook, you put your little deer lips down to the cool, clear water. Bam! A fucking bullet rips off part of your head. Your brains are laying on the ground in little bloody pieces. Now I ask you, would you give a fuck what kind of pants the son of a bitch who shot you was wearing?
Yeah, I generally agree with that approach, that it's about really raising questions for people to draw their own conclusions. On the flip side of that, though, I do think that, and it's really become clear to me as I've started the video making process, and there's some of these things that I've already made the conclusions on in my head, and I felt like, okay, I went through that journey. I'm past globe Earth. I don't really need to be able to defend every single point. However, as we try to present some of these various truths to people out there, I think it is our duty to some degree to be able to present a rational explanation for why you think the way you do. And I think it's also important in that to admit where you don't know and maybe could never know the answers. I mentioned flat Earth earlier, and I think being called a flat earther is a misnomer. I like the term true earther better, because I think that most of the realm that we live in is generally level, but that doesn't mean that I have any concept of what is around that. And I think you get a lot of credibility with people if you say, well, here's what I know and here's what I don't know. And, that's open for discussion and further exploration. But certainly, I think it is incumbent on any of us, and I've been guilty of that laziness myself, to just say, it's a hoax, or, space is fake and gay, but am I prepared to explain why? Dinosaurs aren't real, but can I tell them about the history of, the Edward Drinker Cope and his buddy O.C. Marsh, and, am I prepared to walk them through that the first quote unquote fossil discoveries really started in the mid 1850s and, blew up from there, that was closely linked to the evolution movement. Like, if you have to be able to tell some of these stories coherently even if you don't have all the details, because no one has all the details in their heads. But I think just the process of putting videos together for me has reminded me how many details are out there that I think a lot of us don't put the time and energy into packaging in some way, even if it's, not in a video or written down in some way that, like, if someone asks you, you're prepared to give a defense. I mean, it's much like the scripture says, be prepared to give a defense of your faith. And I think that same concept applies here, that, like, if you're going to go presenting a new worldview to people, you have to be able to present to them something that makes enough sense that can lead them to then go question on their own, not necessarily spoon feed them, all the answers and the appendix. That's their own homework. And so I think it's just really important to also remind ourselves that if you're going to go making blanket statements about something being fake or, hoax or scam or whatever, it's probably a good idea to have a few facts in your pocket that you can share with people to get them thinking as well.
Absolutely. And I learned a little trick today, actually. It's called the eyebrow test. And so if you notice somebody's eyebrows kind of going like down, like, really, they're just looking for the exit, right? But if their eyebrows go up and they arched, then they're intrigued. And you, like you said, you should be prepared to articulate why you're holding that position or presenting that little bit of argument, shall we say. And one thing I've definitely learned is not to, I tend to want to give people my conclusion before I even give them my facts. So I would definitely be the kind of person who's like, well, space is fake and gay. And that's probably all they'll ever remember if I lead with that. Or I'll say, who did 9/11, something like that, who I think did 9/11. It's probably not a good way to get into it. Maybe it's just better to say, did you ever look at that and wonder why there wasn't a huge pile of twisted cement and iron and steel and glass just remaining? Where did all that material go? Or you could even say something like, the largest piece of anything that was in an office was the dial or the touchpad of a phone. I don't think it was a rotary phone by 2001, but everything was just, atomized essentially. And they had to, how did they identify bodies? There were no whole bodies, things like that. So pick your poison and be prepared to defend what you're saying, but don't be defensive and poke fun at things. Like the passport story. That's always a good one.
Yeah. And, it's something that James Corbett said years ago. And I just heard a different spin or version of that earlier tonight. In fact, before we got on air, that I posted to the Central Texas Rabbit Hole Telegram group, which was this younger guy who was having fun with ChatGPT, and I guess there's some version now that can speak that he's got on his phone, and it was like his buddy, and they were doing this. They were talking about like the quote unquote power elite being vampires and having fun, and kind of the message from the video was, laugh at the tyrants, laugh at the people who think they're in control and have it all figured out. I'm not saying laugh at people who are under the deception, but I'm saying we as a community who are wise to the scams and the tricks, we should be having fun with it by laughing at them and taking our power back and not letting them, exert their gloom and doom over us and, let them feel like they're in control, because they're not. They're, whatever their position or station in life was, ultimately appointed to them in some way. And, they're not the ultimate one in control. And all that being said is, we have full license to take our power back and to laugh at those who consider themselves elite. Now, switching gears slightly back to our conversation about dealing with the layman, we can have fun with it in the sense that, we should remember we're trying to help someone reach a better understanding. It's not about winning an argument. And that's where a lot of us, myself included in the past, get trapped, is we feel this well, I know this more than you and I have to prove it to you. That's not the objective. The objective is to go as far up into their border to say, here's something you might think about. Here's something to consider, if they are even willing to hear that. But we have to remember that everyone's got their own pace and time, and it's not our job to teach them discernment, but we can certainly show them the path towards a better understanding. And at the end of the day, as you've said before, Jake, that, maybe some people may never get there. Maybe they just have a different station in life. And it's fine to have friends who never get it, or, family, loved ones, whatever. That's
they're
just
more fun anyway.
Yeah. And sometimes it's a nice break from seeing the world clearly to do dumb things that normies do, and just, take a break from it all. And I think that's another thing for us to remember too, living in that world of, everything's evil and out to get me isn't healthy. You need to take a break from that and laugh at it, go do something else, exercise, whatever your stress reliever is, because it's very easy to get sucked into the black pill world, staying in it too long.
Yeah, living well is the best revenge. Don't harm yourself because the world seems desperate. Get your house in order, and as we said last week with Michael, activate, do something. You just take a step forward towards something.
Absolutely.
And don't get muddled into despair.
Couldn't have said that any better.
Yeah.
Well, Jake, I think we're getting close to the hour mark, and I think we've done a good job of batting this concept around. Were there any parting thoughts that you wanted to kind of wrap us up with?
No, it's just it's an inevitable kind of topic that will come up for people that are on a quest for truth. And I think similar to a lot of the situations we've experienced in the last few years, there's a lot of traps out there when you're on this quest. And so discernment is always something that you really need to be armed with, and choose your battles. Don't see everybody as somebody you need to convert or change. I like what Sam Tripoli, I heard him say in a podcast recently. I love to refer to his podcast. He says that he's the idiot savant. He calls himself a retard. He's got a great podcast. And he said, I'm just done trying to save people. I've come to that same position as well. I'm just like, you do you. I've got my views on things, and sometimes just for fun, I'll poke people with them. And if it doesn't elicit a response, or if they don't take the bait or engage the conversation, I prefer if they push back, actually, rather than just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, nice weather we're having, or, did you see the Raiders game the other day, or whatever. So you just choose your battles and decide whether it's something that you want to do, is to engage in that kind of conversation. Otherwise, just people will crawl out of the woodwork. When you're confident, you carry yourself with confidence and assurance. That can sometimes have the biggest influence over people. I've done that with the way I lived my life, my lifestyle, and my diet, and never preached to anybody, never tried to convert anybody. And I got the most converts over to what I was doing by just doing what I was doing and getting results. And people ask me how I did it. And I think it's similar to what you can do when you're on a quest for truth, is just feel inspired by it, and people will pick up on that, and they'll ask you questions.
Let your light shine and the world will see it.
Perfect.
All right. That sounds like a perfect conclusion to this week's episode. And I'd say just tune in to next week. I'm sure we'll have something new and intriguing to share with you. And let me just remind our listeners and viewers, we would love to have more guests on here. we're two guys living our lives, and we carve out time each week to do this, but we don't have producers. We don't have anyone chasing people around. So the bandwidth is limited. If you want to be part of the conversation, just reach out. There's a number of ways you can find us and contact us. So definitely get in touch if you want to be part of the conversation. You don't have to be anyone famous or have anything total revolutionary to say. Like, if you just want to chat with us and have a conversation like this, we would be thrilled. So definitely reach out. But for the rest of you, stay tuned and we'll be back with more.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.